Hey everyone, welcome to Zeitgeist in 2026, a show where we talk about all the latest TV and movies while we listen to the latest music. Today, I am Jordan Conrad, and as always, joining me is my co-host, Neve L. Boz. How you doing today, brother?
How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing okay. I'm doing all right. We've had a little bit of trouble coordinating, but we're finally sitting down and talking about Stranger Things. So it's going to be a pretty exciting podcast. We are talking about 1980s and specifically the nostalgia that comes with a lot of these programs. Now, what was interesting about Stranger Things is it kind of started as something that was more or less targeted to our age bracket or a little older, Niv. And what is unique is that now it feels like it's targeting the younger generation, like your little sister's age bracket. Who do you know that watches Stranger Things? Do you feel like it's people our age or people younger?
What's really nice about Stranger Things, and even the other show we're going to talk about really soon, is that it actually reinvents a time period where both our generation, like a millennial generation, and Gen Z, they watch it, because I think for them it's a little alien and it just like grabs them because it's a little strange. And for us, it is nostalgia bait, for lack of a better word.
Very much nostalgia bait. Yeah, unique is true. I think that especially nowadays in 2026, with the rise of things like AI and specifically AI slop, a lot of people in the younger generations, even down to Gen Alpha, seem to be more interested in the idea of removing themselves from technology. And I guess you're right. Alien is correct, because then you have a space where these kids can support a analog version of life in their own minds and then go into their real lives where they may have to interact with technology just because of things like education and just daily social life. These things are really important for interacting in real life, but they're not necessarily the most enjoyable for everybody to use all of the time. They come with a lot of downside, obviously. And so, yeah, what's unique about the 1980s is it is more or less the last time we existed without computers being a mainstay in our lives. And yet, even in Stranger Things, as we move from the beginning of the show in 1983 to when the show ends, slowly the personal computer becomes a part of their lives. And there's the character of Susie who's dating Dustin, and we'll talk more about these characters and who they're played by in more detail in a second. But the character of Susie is a character with a personal computer, and they actually use the computer in the show. And so it's like an early age version of what we know now is something that's ubiquitous and in our pockets and literally like engaged with our bodies. In the case of like a Ray-Ban sunglasses, they can become like you have a computer literally that you wear, like your watch or your sunglasses can become wearables. So being able to remove ourselves from that, I think we have these fantasies of what the world was like before. And maybe that's less of a big deal for millennial or even, I would say, younger Gen Xers who are probably more in tune with the 80s and like remember it as teenagers. But then there's our generation where we kind of are right on that cusp. I mean, you and I don't remember the 80s. Neither of us were born in the 80s. We were both born in the 90s.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think what's interesting about that period of time, and maybe even the 70s too, was the idea that the main protagonists of movies that really brought appeal were movies where the protagonist was a teenager. I'm thinking about Back to the Future. I'm thinking about Dirty Dancing. Those were the movies that captured the entire general public's attention. E.T. was the last great example for me of where the main characters were essentially teenagers. And then it transitioned, ironically, to another like Steven Spielberg film of like Jurassic Park. It essentially was the big movie that convinced the general public that adults should be the protagonists again. And I think it just escalated from that. The main characters are more the parents and the adults in the movie rather than the kids.
I mean, movies and TV are more or less the media of a slightly older generation now. Not much older, but you don't see as many things targeted towards Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And also, the 1980s were the era of the latchkey kid. And this is a foundational element to Stranger Things.
The last sort of big movie where a kid was the protagonist was Home Alone. And can you guess when that movie came out?
Well, Home Alone came out right after the 80s. It would have been probably 91, 92.
But it was actually 1990. So literally at the break point of 89 to 90 was the last sort of cutoff point, because the next big movie that I can think of where a child is really important is Terminator 2 Judgment Day.
And that was...
which came out in 91.
That was right after that. So yeah, generally you don't see a lot of it. And it does still happen, but there are adult characters and kid characters. Whereas in something like Home Alone, there is really no adult protagonist. I mean, when I think of last year...
other than Catherine O'Hara.
Rest in peace. We love Catherine O'Hara here. But, well, I wanted to point out Minecraft, which was a huge movie of last year and is based on a video game and does really signify Gen Z entertainment. But yes, there are kids as protagonists. There's a kid who is also in the same range as at Netflix, they have the Wednesday series, which is YA and focuses on kids, but that's a TV show. In the movie world, Minecraft is the equivalent. And in Minecraft, you have Jack Black and Jason Momoa. Yeah. So there are proxies for both adults and children, not just kids. And I think that is largely because now, A, kids maybe aren't going to the movies as much, and B, we do live in a more protective society where nowadays you don't see as many people under the age of 13 going to the movies by themselves.
I love the Jack Black comparison, but I think a better example would be Jumanji, where the remake of the Jumanji films have been sort of about kids, but they transform into avatars that are adults, meaning The Rock, Kieran Gillian, Kevin Hart, and Jack Black. So you see the kids section at the length of 20 to 30 minutes in a film, whereas the rest of the film, it's basically the adult actors play the teenage characters. Even movies that are focused on children, and I mean blockbuster movies, you always need an adult to actually handle the steering wheel or be the draw power, because I don't think movies, the big movies, the big budgeted movies, they don't have patience anymore to believe in an unknown star where they can just be all right, we're just gonna pick this child actor that nobody really knows him or they know him from this TV show, put him in front of a blockbuster movie and then just roll with it.
But talking about Stranger Things specifically, so this also has a particular aspect that is removed from our modern sensibilities. It is based largely around the hometown of Hawkins, Indiana. And what is fascinating is as this series goes on, you're slowly seeing the purview of this show not only broaden in terms of scope away from Hawkins, but it also spends more time on the adult characters. You don't just get this reliance on the children. In the first season, the main cast is predominantly a bunch of children. I think they're about maybe 9 or 10 years old. And these kids are Will Byers, who Will Byers is the son to Joyce Byers, played by Winona Ryder, who takes a relatively small role in the first season, as well as Jim Hopper, who is looking for Will when he gets kidnapped into a place we later know as the Upside Down.
Will Byers is played by Noah Schnapp, and David Harbour plays
Jim Hopper. In the rest of the main cast, you have Mike Wheeler, played by Finn Wolfhard. He is sort of the group leader, the dungeon master of their D&D group, and he later becomes the boyfriend to Eleven. And Eleven is the other major character in this show. She gains prominence as the show goes on, almost certainly becoming, in the final season, I would regard the main character, who is played by Millie Bobby Brown. Millie Bobby Brown, I would argue, is probably the most famous of this cast, but I would like to get to that in a second, a little later, when we talk about...
Yeah, that could be highly debated, actually.
When we talk more about sort of the broad scope of how this show has taken off culturally, which it almost certainly has become a beast much, much, much larger than the core components of this first season. There's also Dustin Henderson, played by Gatson Matsuro. He is the friend of Mike Lucas, who is played by Caleb McLaughlin, and Will Byers. So he in this show is kind of the dweebier, probably, of the whole group. Lucas is pivoted later in.
A jock.
Yes. Will is kind of somewhere in between. He is finding himself as the show goes on, almost certainly.
Yeah.
And really finds himself in this final season, for better or for worse. We spend a lot of time on Will. So the premise of the show, for those who are unfamiliar, is more or less supernatural horror in the style of, would you say Stephen King is the most prominent influence? I mean, there's a huge sphere of influence beyond Stephen King. You could say it's similar to E.T. in a lot of ways, especially in that first season. You could say
absolutely
it's similar to...
I mean, there's one that I think of that you definitely don't think of. I think of Elfen Lied, which is actually like a manga by Lin Okamoto. And it's because like the premise of it is very, very similar to Stranger Things.
Does it take place in the 80s as well?
It's from like 2000s. But I thought about that. The opening moments of the pilot are so striking and so memorable that you're just kind of like, it's like considered very iconic. But the point I'm trying to make is that like the main character of that show has somewhat similar powers to Eleven. She also has like a relationship with a boy that finds her. So I find it really interesting. This sort of like storyline has appeared in other places. And of course, like everything is a steal at the end of the day. I mean, this clearly takes inspiration from both Stephen King, as you said, but also Steven Spielberg, specifically E.T. And in fact, borrows a lot of imagery from E.T. in multiple seasons.
It's tough, honestly, to say that Stranger Things has anything really of unique note in isolation, because I've seen a lot of people online, especially as this final season has gone around and we finally get the full scope of the narrative. And there have been a lot of critics, and I think I'll be one of them throughout this episode, which is that the show does a lot of borrowing. It does a lot of wearing its influences on its sleeve. And those influences do vary quite a bit as the show goes on. And the themes of the show morph and adapt and shift. In the first season, it feels very much like a supernatural horror show where you don't really get a sense of what the Upside Down is like. All you know is that Will Byers goes there and it really changes him. And we learn more and more and more about what that change actually looks like. And I would say that the final season pays a lot of tribute to where the show began in the first. The second season feels like a sequel in the sense that it is a little broader in scope. It has a little bit more action. It is more focused on the action. Not to say that season 1 had no action, but season 2 focuses, I would say, a little heavier on the action. They frequently utilize D&D language in order to talk about this spectral horror that is largely beyond comprehension. So they'll call the villain in season 4 Vecna, despite the fact that he has a real name. And they continue to do this throughout the show. So there's Demogorgons and there's Demodogs, and there are various other creatures. Mind Flayer, which is more or less the smoke monster from Lost.
Yeah.
There's a number of other interesting things in the Upside Down that defy logic and maybe even defy explanation, because not everything really does get explained neatly as the show ends, unfortunately. But the characters on the show do slowly learn more and more about the Upside Down. In season 3, we get a really big change. The characters age a lot. They become teenagers. And we also get a plot in the show which involves Russians. And the Russians and the more adult characters becoming more prominent becomes a bigger shift in season 3. And it's also where I think one of the major problems of the show pops up. And that is that this show has a really, really, really dense and bloated plot as time moves on. In the first season, it's very contained. I would say the second season, I think, holds up really well because it holds really tight to the first season's plot mechanics. Season 3 and beyond start to lose me a little bit. When I was originally watching the show for pleasure, back as the show was airing, I actually stopped watching. And it was only when the final season came out and I thought it would be wise for us to cover it on Zeitgeist that I felt the pull to retreat back into the world of Hawkins. And I found a lot of joy in the final season because it focuses more heavily on Hawkins. But I would say that seasons 3 and 4 can be a bit of a drudge specifically because they move away from this quaint town. And I wanted to address that with you here. How do you feel the story adapts and changes as it expands in scope. Do you feel like it is core to the mechanics of what makes the show unique, and specifically also that quintessential 80s-ness where you really feel like you're in this like magical world as a kid and through a kid's eyes?
It's interesting because I think every season had its really strong moment, but I also think it had its very weak moment. In season 1, it was all like the intrigue, right? Of what is this world? It very much showed us like what this world could be in terms of not just Hawkins, but also sort of the upside down and mythology of like the demigorgons and all that stuff. Of course, in connection to the eyes of these children, right? The perspective of these children, because they're the ones who essentially name these things for us based on D&D terminology, because that has consumed their lives. It's the joy in their lives, and it's a joy for us as viewers. But obviously, because season 1 was season 1, it was very slow, right? Because it operated on the mystery. And it harkened me back to TV shows that I used to watch as a teenager, like Smallville, because the core mystery was so slow building. And that's how like Smallville operated, like, Monster of the Week. Even though, again, interestingly enough, it wasn't Monster of the Week in season 1 of Stranger Things. Season 2, I think you said it really well. It was almost like the Terminator 2 or the Aliens to original Alien and original Terminator, because it just went bigger. There was more action. The characters became more well-defined. Rather, they weren't necessarily the victims anymore. They were the heroes now, because it wasn't just Eleven saving the day, but the kids also saving the day. I would be remiss not to mention the fact that Sadie Singh was introduced in season 2. And Joe Carey, who's also like another core member of the cast, he became like not only a season regular starting from season 2, but he became a very heroic character that became almost like iconic, because in season 1, he was like an antagonist.
Right. Herrington is arguably sort of the biggest character changing from season 1 to season 2, where initially the idea for Herrington was that he was supposed to be kind of a bad boy villain. And what ended up happening was actually that Max's brother, who I don't remember the name of off the top of my head.
So the actor is Zachary Montgomery, and he played the character Billy.
Billy, sure. So Billy becomes more or less the character that they were envisioning Herrington to be, Steve Herrington. Joe Keery is, of course, the actor who plays Steve, and he is more or less a larger-than-life character to the world of the show because he is so complex. He really has a dichotomy of character. He used to be the cool kid, but now he has to adapt into the new world post high school. And so you get this trifecta, right? With Steve and Steve's people and Steve's friends. And that's usually him and Dustin, who kind of become a duo.
The main bromance.
And then you have the other kids.
We could easily agree that Mike, he's like the main kid, right? But there's another group that develops from these kids, from connection to these kids. And it's like the actual teenagers who grow up to be adults in the show. Will, it's Mike's sister, like Natalie Dyer. Sorry, the actress is Natalie Dyer, but she plays Nancy Wheeler. And of course, Will's brother, Jonathan Byers, played by Charlie Heaton.
Right.
Joe Carey's Steve Herrington becomes almost the main character from those teenagers because there's so much exposure placed on him.
But I also think he's the deepest character when you look at that.
He is, because he's given the most conflict. He was in love with like Nancy, and he lost her to Jonathan. And that is sort of his crux, right? That he's forever chasing her and he can never get her. And he is actually more, because of his immaturity, ironically, his immaturity is actually what ties him to the kids, which gives him like, he's the perfect bridge. And that's why he gets the most exposure and the most conflict out of any other character, because he's literally in between both those worlds.
Yeah.
But I think it is really interesting that, you have actual adults here too. Winona Ryder and David Harbour very much lead the charge with those characters, the actual like responsible responsible adults in the room. But you asked me a question of like how I would break down each season. And season 2 does go bigger, it does go better. I think that for the most part, it's actually the strongest season because it does like the sequel trick of like you take what worked so well in the first season and then you push the envelope and make it better. Season 3, it has the threequel first. Whenever there's a 3, there's an issue. Spider-Man 3, and for you, The Dark Knight Rises are like big examples. But I think it did try to go bigger, but it murked the waters a bit. I think the strongest part of season 3 is Maya Hawke, right? Because she gets introduced in that season and she actually completes sort of the teenagers group herself in really beautiful ways. And it was also her first big role. It put her in the zeitgeist, along with many other of these actors, actually.
Yeah.
Season 4 was a return to form, right? Because they went back to basics, even though...
Basics?
It was still... I know. Just hear me out. There was sort of like that issue of splitting all the characters apart, right? Because some of them were in Los Angeles, in Russia, and in Hawkins. But it went back to basics of like, even though they were all apart, they did actually go back to characters first, rather than just action. It felt almost like we were exploring the characters back in season 1, where it did feel like, we were individually exploring these characters. And a big reason why season 4 was so effective was also because of an actor/character that was introduced, which was Eddie, played by Joseph Quinn, who has exploded.
Huge.
Because of his role. He has starred in Fantastic Four and Gladiator 2, and he continues to be like a mainstay in mainstream movies now. But Eddie did something really magical. He brought back a lot of character work back into the show because it focused on the relationships again, not the action. And I think another actor and character that did that very well was the main antagonist of not just that season, but the rest of the show, Jamie Campbell Bower. So I feel like it brought the show back to life a bit and it made it exciting because it ushered in what the final season could be. But then the final season became what it was, right? Which is very, very classic in the world of television, where it's really, really hard to build like a final season because there's so much expectations involved. And I feel like that's what happened. There were so many expectations involved at the last season. There was so much to explain. But the issue was, especially with a show like this that is high concept, a lot of people might disagree with me that, like Stranger Things isn't that high concept, but
what?
When it involves, well, that's what I'm trying to say. Like anything that's outside of the upside down is not high concept.
Well, right. I would say it's soft sci-fi in the sense that it's not a whole new fantasy world like Game of Thrones. But in terms of the amount of lore that Stranger Things builds, especially post season 3, see, I would say that seasons 1 and 2, I could actually make that argument where it's a distilled version of a Stephen King-like story. But Stephen King was notedly on cocaine through most of the 80s, and he was creating a lot of lore and a lot of craziness. And I mean, the Dark Tower series was like him going full bolt towards this fantasy shared universe where all of his stories more or less combine and congeal. And I think nowadays in the 2020s, people are really, really into that, which is why you're getting so much Stephen King content. That's just to say the story initially started, I think, very small, but I would say as time moved on, and particularly into the 4th and 5th seasons, it's really hard for me to justify anything resembling like a grounded character-based story because there's so much going on. I mean, I guess you could kind of say it is grounded in the sense that it's like grounded in the world, but most of the things that happen in the world involve mad scientists or a operation on a base in Russia, which is, I would say, like pretty big action storytelling and is not remotely grounded in the slightest. I also would argue that in seasons 4 and partially 3 and partially 5, it just completely tilts the scale away from what made the show great initially, which is that character-based storytelling, and I think divides the characters up too much, and in fact divides what we think of as like a main character up completely. And in the final season, we are getting, I would say I actually like the final season a great deal more than seasons 3 and 4, and it's because I think that it gives better credence to Finn Wolfhard as an actor, and it gives Mike a little bit more to do. Whereas I found season 4 unbearable because Mike was so much in the background. And I'll tell you this, man. I wrote up a list of characters as we were outlining for this episode. Do you know how many main characters I wrote? If you include Brett Gelman, Maya Hawke, Sadie Sink, Priya Ferguson, who becomes a major role, I counted more than a dozen characters, and that doesn't include Holly Wheeler and Derek, who become, I would say, major characters in season 5. That brings the total to 16 characters, Niv. 16. How many main characters does an effective TV show have, in your opinion?
I always argue that it's based on the episode. An episode can have one protagonist, usually, because it's based on like focus and exposure, right?
Cool. So
that's my argument.
Within a rational season, then, you are working with 8 episodes. That means that the maximum amount of main characters you would have if you did it serialized, where each character, it was more or less like Haunting of Hill House. Let's say that.
Yeah.
Then you get 8 main characters, period, which means that there would be absolutely no overlap. That is half of the total main characters by the end of the season. Now, I guess we can argue semantically whether Brett Gelson, who we haven't yet mentioned, I don't think, is a main character, despite the fact that he is, in fact, a main cast character. Murray Bauman is the friend of Jim Hopper. He speaks Russian, which becomes a very important part in season 4, and he becomes kind of part of a core group that goes to Russia to save Jim Hopper after, I guess, spoilers for the show. This is getting into major spoilers. Jim Hopper is presumed dead at the end of season 3, but then, of course, comes back in seasons 4 and 5. Now, this is also something that is unique to our modern age, which is, I guess you could trace it all the way back to like Death of Superman, which happened in the 90s, but is more and more and more common as the 2010s and the 2020s, to the point where in the Star Wars universe, they completely shelved a project that the CEO of Star Wars, Kathy Kennedy, wanted to go through. The CEO stopped this project because it would have brought back a character who was presumed dead in the Star Wars universe. And he was like, enough is enough.
Palpatine has returned.
Right. He's like, we can't keep doing this in our series. We have gotten clowned time and time and time again for that specific moment. Palpatine returning. We can't bring back more villains and heroes. We have to stop. And Star Wars is infamous for that. This has happened. The character of Boba Fett comes back. The character of Palpatine comes back.
Actually, I blame, if we're talking Star Wars, and we can always talk Star Wars, I blame George Lucas, because the original perpetrator of this little thing was actually Ben Kenobi, because he came back as a Force ghost.
In the Star Wars worlds. I guess you're right. Back in the 80s, even before they brought back Superman in the comics.
Yeah. So I blame George Lucas.
Okay, there you go. We'll blame George Lucas. There and again, you can give some grace to storytelling, where if you are bringing back a character, but there is some kind of Pyrrhic victory, in the case of Obi-Wan Kenobi, he isn't really a person. He is a ghost that speaks to a person. And so he is sort of the subjective experience to a particular character versus, in the case of Jim Hopper, he goes from being like a main character in season 3 to being a main character in season 4 with almost no gap or, any particularities of stakes, right? Like, okay, if you want to talk about George Lucas, let's go back to the 50s, man. Why don't we talk about Tolkien? Like this, the kind of death and rebirth that has existed in high concept, which I'm calling Stranger Things 2, has been around for a very, very, very long time. And I do think that may be partially to blame with the very first story ever widely distributed, the Bible. So when we're talking about
on this pod in this new year, because that is all we can do. Name drop Jesus.
That's all we can do. Praise his name.
The Lord.
So,
and I say that as a Jew.
Oh my goodness. So there and again, the story of Jesus himself. Let's talk about that original narrative and why it works.
Oh my God. Can we not?
Is because there is a Pyrrhic victory at the end of it, right? You have a victory, but the victory is at a cost. And in the case of Stranger Things, I don't find the cost is always tantamount. Things don't always happen with very clear stakes. So what you end up getting is not only a bloated plot where the elements extend way beyond your weight, and you're getting a story that is 100 pounds of bricks in a 10-pound bag. You also get unclear stakes. By the end of the show, you have this main character. We've worked our way up to a big bad, what we would call in D&D a BBEG, a big bad evil guy. And the big bad evil guy is Henry. As you mentioned, he is played with incredible gravitas. I mean, the show cannot help but originate the character back to Jamie Campbell Bower, despite the fact that in season 4, he is largely played by the actor who was originally Freddy Krueger in the Nightmare films. And you don't really get much of a sense of him other than he's like a veiny, scary guy. And by the final season, he is Henry, and he's played by a rather charming redheaded character.
Especially like in the flashbacks, right? It's just...
But lesser so. And we don't always... I mean, in season 4, to kind of explain the plot mechanics more or less, we don't know that Henry and Vecna are the same person until
like the end.
The end of Zone 1 or Volume 1 or whatever they call it. Sort of the moment when they cut the episode. It's what Netflix does instead of releasing things as episode by episode by episode.
But if I remember correctly, Volume 1 of Season 4 was 7 whole episodes, where Volume 2 was 8 and 9. You know what I mean? Look, I agree with you that ultimately what this show does really well is take these characters, take these actors really, and really give them material to work with. They did that.
You think?
Yeah, I really do, because...
I think Jamie Campbell Bower gets a lot to work with. I don't know if everybody gets equal stake.
No, but think about it. Like, so many stars have spawned from this show alone. And I can go down the list.
Well, we should go down the list.
Yeah, okay, we will. Here it is. Finn Wolfhard, who's been in practically every teenage movie known to man recently. He, get the scrawny main character? That's Finn Wolfhard. Millie Bobby Brown.
Do you think he's the most famous? We were talking at blows about who would be the most famous. So I would say Millie Bobby Brown is close. I would say Finn Wolfhard is second from what I've seen.
So I think Millie Bobby Brown, she's famous. A lot of it is because of Enola Holmes.
I wouldn't say that that's remotely what makes her the most famous. I think she's an influencer first.
She is an influencer first, but when it comes to film projects, Enola Holmes is her big thing. It's under the Netflix umbrella, where Finn Wolfhard has wide distribution of films. I think Gaten, he hasn't found that much success in mainstream movies, but he's found some success in a lot of indies.
I mean, in many ways, he is kind of the silent star, because he has, I think, the kind of success that many actors dream of having, but he isn't using that success to become the next big Hollywood A-lister. He's using it to become an actor the way he would want to be an actor, or the way I think many actors want to be actors, speaking as one. And that is to not necessarily take on a ton of IP projects, where Finn Wolfhard definitely takes on big projects. He's got It, he's doing Ghostbusters. I would argue Millie Bobby Brown definitely has that with Godzilla. She did 2 Godzilla movies.
Yeah.
So she isn't just Netflix, but I would say that she is largely still within the Netflix ecosystem. I think Gadsden also has an unscripted show that he hosts on Netflix. I'm not as familiar with it.
Gaden.
Sure, Gaden.
I think the other big star that we're forgetting is actually Sadie Sink. She's a model. She's been in The Whale, so she's been in an Oscar movie. She's going to be the new Spider-Man as one of the main characters. And most importantly, she's also been on stage with, I believe it's Proctor as the villain or something like that, which has also been getting a lot of Tony buzz. In terms of who's the most critically talented, that is a very broad thing to say. But I think the industry has been very welcoming towards Sadie Sink in particular, because she has actually been the dark horse for, between the kids. And I think Joe Carey, of course, has also been exploding, but not necessarily as an actor.
No, he's not really done a ton of film work, but he is in the Pavements documentary from last year, which was kind of a script scripted, not scripted, hybrid movie, and he was also on Fargo. I guess I didn't actually see that show, but I've got a 3 sections here. I've got how famous is this Stranger Things star? In Very, I have Finn Wolfhard. I have Millie Bobby Brown, who is, I would say, undeniable. She has 2 brands. She has over 66 million followers on Instagram. She is, I would say, in the top 100 in terms of Instagram influencers of everyone on Instagram. So she is huge as an influencer, even more than as a movie star. But I also think that maybe Millie is going to be choosy about being a movie star because she can be such a strong influencer. And I think that that can continue on. I don't think she has to stop making movies. I don't think she will stop making movies. Finn Wolfhard, on the other hand, he's gotten more into directing, it seems, because he just directed his feature Hell of a Summer.
That's true.
In the very category, the 2 people we've left out is obviously Winona Ryder, and I think that that goes without saying. And then I'd say David Harbour.
Yeah.
David Harbour has had a major role in almost every Hollywood movie since 2019. He was the lead in Hellboy. He did Violent Night, which was pretty successful. He was in Black Widow, which was successful. He was in Gran Turismo. And then, of course, he's continued on in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Thunderbolts, I imagine he'll probably do something in the new Avengers movies, whether there's 2 or 3 or 5.
Most importantly, he's been the main inspiration for Lily Allen's new album.
And that is so true. That cannot be understated.
It really can't.
I don't know if you just overheard my producer, Jolin, giggling in the background there. That's fully true. In terms of my mostly category, Sadie Sink is right at the top. She and
Maya Hawke, probably.
She and Gaten are, I would say, the 2 people that are more strongly focused on the stage and about honing their craft. She is going to be a huge part of the film landscape this year, for sure. We're definitely going to be covering her later. Maya Hawke and Joe Keery are both people who are largely more focused on music, but I think she might still be the kind of person you'd continue to see in Oscar movies as time moves on. And then Brett Gelman, who you and I know have both definitely owned stock in him for forever. He was in the Netflix show Love, which you and I both really enjoyed. That was from one of the major comedy voices of the 2010s, Judd Apatow. He is really good at playing that particular guy. Is Noah Schnapp doing much other than trolling online?
He's like an influencer as well, but obviously not like Millie Bobby Brown is.
By the time this podcast has come out, Lucas's new movie, Goat, a animated film, Caleb McLaughlin.
Yeah.
He's got a new movie, and he's a main character in that. He's voice acting. It's supposed to be a really, really big animated movie. It's doing okay.
We haven't talked much of the show. We haven't even covered like Conformity Gate or season 5.
I want to talk about Conformity Gate before we get out of here.
But I think it's really important to say that we talked so much about nostalgia. A big thing that has propped up this nostalgia has been the characters, not just the way they've been designed and constructed, but also the actors that have been called into Stranger Things, which have been like 80s and pop culture like icons. So Sean Astin, who plays Bob Newby in season 2, he is, one of the hobbits from Lord of the Rings. You have Linda Hamilton in this newest season, and she's from Terminator, and she plays like one of the antagonists in this season. And Carrie Ellis, who was the main character in The Princess Bride, also.
Yeah, he plays a major part in seasons 3 and 4, I believe.
This show has been really good at knowing what it does well. It is actually like an actor attractor. And another actor attractor we will cover very soon is actually industry. But, I think it's a really good marker of a show when you're an actor attractor. Because if an actor wants to be part of your show, even if they're really big and you wouldn't imagine them being on that show, that is such a huge stamp of approval. And it really did start with Winona Ryder. Because without her, there would be no show.
Yeah, but I would argue that the main issue is, yes, I have to concede that the show is really interested in doing what is kind of an old school TV trick, which is character pairing and moving characters from one zone to another. Because you have in the later 2 seasons, which I want to focus more on, is Maya Hawke and Natalie Dyer get paired together, and you see these 2 kind of playing off each other. And Nancy is a very different character character from Robin. And in season 3, Robin and Joe Keery's character Steve have a really great tat-a-tat. And then in season 4, Robin and Nancy have a little bit of tension because they don't necessarily work as well together. And then in season 5, Robin and Will come together. And that's a really, really, really important part of season 5 because of what that show covers, which is acceptance in being sexually deviant in the world of the 80s. And how does that fare? And that is directly correlated to in season 4, it's about religious deviance and the idea that in the 1980s, there was the satanic panic and the character...
Eddie.
The character, yes. Indeed. He is like sort of the main focal character, right? And so in these shows, you have what I would argue is a very clear and obvious main character. And as the show continues on, the show is so into expanding its scope and adding Russians, which I think was a really dramatic mistake. And so what you end up getting is, yes, a ton of really talented actors, but then you get this really clear bisection between the action storytelling and the very, very, very quiet moments. And I would say that as the show goes on, that chasm becomes greater and greater and greater, almost directly relational to the fact that there is like a literal life and death event creating a chasm in the world of the show. And as that is happening, you see more and more these characters just stopping what they're doing, sitting down, and having a 3-minute conversation that doesn't necessarily belong. And I think that that's a huge issue. And I think that when you are working with a show that has these character stakes, it's important to be able to meld the character stakes with the world stakes together. And if you fail to do that, I think you just haven't really succeeded as a program. And that's the tough thing, I think, about Stranger Things, is that the budget continues to expand, the cast continues to expand, the prestige continues to expand, and I would argue that it hasn't earned it all. And it's real shame because I think that we're going to talk about in the second half a show that earns it so much better and does it on a fraction of the cost. Now, I would say I'm going to pivot to what is probably the final section we'll talk about today, if in brief, which is conformity gate, which is exactly what I'm talking about. The fact that the fans of the show have rioted because they feel that the character relationships that they were drawn to in the first season were unsatisfyingly paid off in the final season. And it became such a huge problem that it crashed Netflix's servers because as the show final episodes came out, everybody was looking online and going like, well, there has to be more because this can't be it. And that's such a shame. I think that the final moments of the show do pay great tribute to Mike as a character. And I think that because he's the character that started on the show, it was so important that we land the plane on him. And I think that in broad scope, season 5 does a much better job at focusing on these main characters. But it's such a shame because when you're working on a show that is so broad in scope and you just can't find how that ties back to the character relationships, I think that it means that the show just isn't as interesting. And it's so hard to say because that first season, I feel like, had such great potentiation. And instead of focusing on that dark aesthetic that it really drew upon, it became more and more like a show from 2026 instead of a show from 1985.
The last time we had such a huge backlash towards a show's finale was season 8 of Game of Thrones, right? There was an entire petition for them to just rewrite the entire season with new creators. And I agree with you. I think what Stranger Things did really well was land the plane in those final moments by focusing on Mike, because he was the character that actually started it all. It actually tied it very beautifully to the core sort of motif of the show, which is D&D, and how it's ageless. And it really convinces you that it's ageless because D&D is representative of adventure and how it passes on that sense of adventure and imagination passes on to the next generation. And that was the most beautiful thing, that what Mike and his friends went through the entire show was ultimately inherited by another group. And that's what I mean. We've been talking about the idea of groups, of how these different age groups have been portrayed in in this show, whether it was the adults, with Jim Hopper and Winona's character, Joyce Byers, or the teenagers of like Joe Carey, Charlie Heaton, and Natalie Dyer, or of course the main group of kids. But season 5 introduced, and we didn't even talk about this because there's so much to talk about, but season 5 introduced the idea of even younger kids, right?
I mentioned that there's Holly Wheeler, who is the person that inherits, and it makes sense because Mike is more or less ostensibly the main character of the show, so it makes sense that Holly, who was, I think, beautifully portrayed by the actor, do you have her name?
Yeah, Nell Fisher.
Beautifully portrayed. And her side character, Derek, who definitely functions as a good foil to Holly, wonderfully played both of them. And a strong potential to what Stranger Things really has in its sack of tricks when you actually get right down to it.
Derek was played by, I think, like an Illinois actor or a Chicago actor, Jake Connolly. But there is a joke that even though obviously Stranger Things has its cast of characters, one of the big backlashes was Nell Fisher's, like the focus on Nell Fisher's character, Holly. I think somebody compared Holly's runtime with the rest of the characters' runtime, and she doubled all of them. But I think a big reason why this season failed is because it did the standard thing that all big shows do in their final season. They bring the characters together. They have the sort of pieces that lead up to one huge final showdown, but they don't actually take their time. They rush through everything. So it just feels half-baked when we finally get there. And that's what it was in terms of like this conformity gate, this belief that there was actually another secret episode that would actually serve as the finale to tie up things much better than the episode that we actually got. And I think it's such a shame because both Game of Thrones and Stranger Things, I believe, had like a runtime of like 8 episodes. I think Game of Thrones had like 6 or something like that. And the way the creators argued against like the shortened season count, because there have been seasons of Stranger Things that have been 9 episodes, and there have been seasons of Game of Thrones that were like 10 episodes. They argued that each episode is like an hour plus. And I'm like, okay, cool. But when we're going to talk about Cobra Kai very soon, guess how many episodes they had, like in their final season?
Well, they had quite a few more, yeah.
Yeah, they had half more. Out of all the series that they had, each season was 10 episodes. But the final season was 15 episodes. They extended it on purpose because they knew they needed a lot more time to do it justice. These creators have been doing these shows for so long, and this was also a symptom in Game of Thrones, that it just feels like they want to be done with it and move on to other things. And that's how these final seasons suffer, because I don't know how the Duffer Brothers would respond to me saying this, but I think most of the time final seasons quote unquote fail because the creators have lost sort of the spark, the love that they originally had for the show they began with.
I think that's a good argument. And I think that the best way to effectively investigate that argument is to talk about Cobra Kai officially, which we'll do so in just a second. We'll take a quick break, listen to some music. I'm going to grab some more water, and then we're going to talk about that show that came out exactly a year ago now, the final episodes of Cobra Kai. Stay tuned. Yes, this is a break. No, not the music you were promised. That involves a thing called licensing, which happens on the Zeitgeist homepage, which is on Mixcloud. I personally curate the music for every single episode. It's easy to start the episode in this exact spot and pick up where you left off. If not, no worries. Let's just pretend you were listening. And we are back. Okay, now, Cobra Kai. So one interesting comparison point that I want to lead us into with Cobra Kai is that the kids on Cobra Kai and the kids on Stranger Things have a particular thing in common, which is that when the Stranger Things cast began their run, they were little babies. And when they obviously ended their run, they became more or less full-grown adults. In the show Cobra Kai, the main difference is because this is a less expensive show, a less resource-intensive show, you get what a lot of people criticized in Stranger Things resolved, which is that the actors more or less resemble the age that they are portraying on screen. And they do this all the while some of these actors do reach major heights. So the story of Cobra Kai, as a quick disclaimer, is about the villain of the original Karate Kid movies. So for those who don't remember, Karate Kid was a major franchise in the 80s. It was a combination of the kung fu, karate, martial arts craze around Hollywood, whether it be imported films, which were becoming more and more prominent from the East, or whether they be just more kind of simple stuff. You had the Chuck Norris movies, you had movies like Bloodsport, you had the Rocky films, which I think very closely ally with the story of the Karate Kid. And the Karate Kid himself is, I would say, the deuteragonist of Cobra Kai, the main character being Johnny Lawrence, who was the antagonist originally in the Karate Kid. Throughout the 6 seasons of Cobra Kai, you get the other side of the story. You get to see what motivated Johnny as the villain of Karate Kid, and you get to see what he's like now as an adult. And throughout the show, you also get a will they, won't they kind of thing, but for friendship, where Johnny and Daniel begin as adversaries, and as time goes on, they have to work together. I don't think that's too much of a spoiler to say that. It's very, very clear from the beginning of the show where the show ends. I wouldn't say that that is a detriment to the show. I would say that is largely a positive. You get sort of the broad scope of what this program is going to be from the very, very first episode. Throughout the show, it continues to pay off. In terms of the kids, I want to shout out the kid who plays Miguel Diaz, who's the champion of season 1 and the main character of the show under Johnny for the program at large. He becomes less and less important as the show continues on, but as opposed to Finn Wolfhard's character in Stranger Things, I think that Sholo continues to get really good placement, even in the final season of Cobra Kai. And he also continues on in the DC universe, ostensibly continuing on in James Gunn's cinematic universe, where he plays the Blue Beetle, who is still canonical in the world of Superman and Supergirl and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Although I wonder if he will play a major part. That being said, I thought Cobra Kai was so interesting. And what's fascinating is that I think that, Niv, you and I were talking about this show maybe 2 years ago when you were watching it. Now, it's been a long time probably since you've thought too much about the show, and I actually just finished it. It took me a good year to finish watching all 6 seasons.
Crazy.
I'm a busy guy. But here we are now. I was watching the final episodes of Stranger Things and the final episodes of Cobra Kai in tandem. So I have a very clear idea of how these shows differ and how they are similar. And I would say that what is unique to both shows, not only is it really tantamount to 1980s nostalgia in the world of Cobra Kai that manifests more so in the relationships to characters that have long grown up. And we remember from whether it's the Karate Kid 1, 2, or 3, where all major characters eventually return, or whether it is the guitar licks, the vibe of the show, which has a lot of this like very nostalgic sounding music, whether it's just the way that it feels like a true blue TV program instead of a show that more closely resembles Stranger Things. So on that note, we were talking about a lot of these things. What drew you initially to Cobra Kai?
Stranger Things always tried to be a show with depth. It put its like influences on top of it, right? We talked about Stephen King, we talk about Spielberg, but I think Cobra Kai wanted to stay true to itself. And what I mean by that is how The Karate Kid was ultimately a movie about something that quite simplistic, which is good triumphs over evil. And when I say evil, I don't mean Johnny Lawrence's character was the evil that I'm talking about. It's more like there's a kid, he arrives to town and he gets bullied and he studies karate in order to rise up and essentially beat back his bullies. But really, it's a story about perseverance, right? And how like an underdog can win. And I think that the show very smartly takes the theme of the movie and then puts it back on like Johnny Lawrence, who was the antagonist, right? And the original Karate Kid movie, because he is now the underdog. Daniel LaRusso, who was the main character of the original Karate Kid, is no longer the underdog. In fact, he is so heroic that he's literally the antagonist to Johnny Lawrence because he is successful in terms of like both money and reputation, and the fact that Johnny Lawrence is clawing himself back up from obscurity.
And I should note that these actors are underdogs in their own way, because the producer and main character of the show, William Zabka, is the actor who plays Johnny and has not had a ton of success, nor has many of the actors who are on the show. Ralph Macchio, who plays Daniel LaRusso and was the original Karate Kid, is really ultimately best known for his work in the 80s and in modern day as the Karate Kid. He also went on to star in Karate Kid Legends, which I haven't seen and we won't be talking about today. But shout out to the main actor of that movie who was born in the same town as me. That being said, this show then allows for a quieter and more subtle version of what I think Stranger Things was attempting to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think that like the big thing I would compare it to, if we were comparing Stranger Things again to E.T. and Terminator and things like that, or even like the big movies like Grease or Dirty Dancing, I would compare Cobra Kai, not necessarily to the Karate Kid, but I would compare it to something like Mighty Morphin Power Rangers.
Okay.
Because there is like a Saturday morning show vibe to it. And you feel like how low budget it is based on the fact that you see the same locations over and over and over again, whether it be the high school that the kids go to, or like the Miyagi dojo, or the Cobra Kai dojo, or the apartment building where Johnny Lawrence lives, or the car dealership. There are set locations that appear every single time.
And I wouldn't say that's even unique to Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, but it's actually more in line with the idea of like a TV show that knows its limits versus something that's going to use a set once and then tear it all down and build a new set, like they did in Stranger Things fairly often, and they do in a lot of prestige TV, where you either have the choice to shoot on location, which I think often these shows do on account of necessity. They can't just keep tearing down sets and rebuilding them. Even in the case of Star Wars, they're using real locations and then CGing over it in the case of Andor.
Yeah.
But in the world of Cobra Kai, they could shoot pretty much everything in LA, even the stuff in the final season that takes place at the Saikai Taikai, which is overseas in Europe.
Yeah.
Even still.
Yeah, it's so international.
Largely.
And even then,
they can shoot it on sound stages.
Even the Saikai Taikai was on the same location almost the entire season. But I think what's really interesting, and we talked about like a show knowing its limits, it started from the beginning. I think even before we get into that, like the reason why the show was even made is actually due to How I Met Your Mother, the show How I Met Your Mother, because they did like a spoof where both Ralph Macchio and William Zabka appeared on that show as part of like Barney, the character Barney's played by Neil Patrick Harris, his bachelor party, because, you know, they talked about what his favorite movie is, which is The Karate Kid. And the reason is because Johnny Lawrence, to him, is not only his favorite character, but the hero, the true hero of that movie. And that poor idea that Barney, quote unquote, got it wrong, that he wasn't actually the hero of the movie, or maybe he was what spawned the idea to actually like, hey, let's pitch this idea where Johnny Lawrence could be the hero of his own story. And obviously, when they shopped it around, nobody originally took it. Not even Netflix. They passed on it. The streaming site that did pick it up was YouTube.
YouTube Red, which was a short-lived, failed streaming service on YouTube. It's one of the main reasons why YouTube has pivoted really, really, really hard away from the streaming wars, despite the fact that it is still, to this day, the most used site on televisions, above anything else, above just regular TV. People use the app of YouTube. They watch YouTube on TV. YouTube is the new television in many ways for a lot of people. And yet, this old school television show is the thing that ends up being maybe the like greatest export, because yes, of course. So it starts in seasons 1 and 2. Season 1 is mainly focused on the rise of Johnny Lawrence down from more or less an alcoholic to a guy who is willing to train his young Padawan in the form of Sholo's character, Miguel. And then he and Miguel work their way up to becoming more or less a Miyagi and Karate Kid.
There's a duo. But then you obviously have, you know, like in the original, you also had like the Johnny Lawrence and John Kreese, like the Palpatine and Vader duo, right?
Exactly. And that's going to be LaRusso and his kid.
And, Tanner Buchanan's like character, Robbie Keane, who has like a special relationship to Johnny because he is his son. And it's really interesting.
And that brings, interesting familial dynamics, right? Now you have the Karate Kid training his rival's kid.
What the show does really well is play with like the dynamics, not just the dynamics of like the characters and the relationships with each other, but also like this idea of what's evil and what's good. Because Daniel is portrayed as like the antagonist, but he is still a hero, right? He uses the Miyagi colors of like white to represent like purity and good nature and just like honor. Whereas Johnny brings back the Cobra Kai colors of black, not necessarily to represent evil, but just like rebellion and bringing down like to him, like the establishment. Basically, for him, it's very much about like liberation.
And that's represented in his dojo. The kids that he has in the show begin with Jacob Bertrand's character, Eli, who has a cleft lip. He calls him Lip early on, which showcases this kind of irreverent spirit. And then later, Eli says, no, I don't want to be known as Lip. I want to be known
as Hawk.
Beyond this. And so he shaves his head into a mohawk and he gets a hawk tattoo on his back. And he's like, I'm Hawk now. And Johnny's like, cool, you're Hawk. There's also the chubby kid, Aisha, who is a huge part of the first season and is also, again, showcasing this kind of dynamic that you're talking about. She is best friends or formerly best friends with Samantha LaRusso, who is the child of Daniel LaRusso.
Yeah, played by Mary Mauser. Yeah.
So you get the lineage. You have the Cobra Kai dojo, and then you have what ends up becoming Daniel's dojo, Miyagi-Do. And within season 1, you have these two sort of building up their own mini, I guess you could call them empires in their way, although I think when you really get into an empire, that's way later into the show. But you have sort of these two gangs, I guess you could call them.
Yeah.
And in season 2, then it's like you're watching West Side Story and the gangs are fighting with each other. And still in relatively small scale. But then there's the moment in season 3 where all of a sudden they are globetrotting, and that's when Netflix comes in, saves Cobra Kai after YouTube Red goes under. Because in the first season, it says on, I think most of the information, it says first season is produced by YouTube Red. Second is under YouTube Premium, which is still the name of YouTube's paid service today, but mainly utilizing other tactics to get people to pay for YouTube. And then in season 3, they finally fold the whole scripted division and Netflix can swoop in and take it on. And of course, when Netflix is producing it, it's a huge, huge, huge bump in terms of production value. And you almost immediately do feel it because it was such a small show in seasons 1 and 2.
But it's also important to say that every season, unlike Stranger Things that played around with what they were going to do, which each season, not just on location, but also the type of action, every single season in Cobra Kai is the same. It's kind of like crazy, like the way the progression works, where you have a conflict that causes all the kids to train, and then they fight at a tournament at the All Valley. I think only one of the season goes away with that because there's like a battle royale instead. And like one of the houses or all of the houses, I don't even remember anymore.
Even seasons 2 and 4 both have a similar trajectory.
Yeah.
Seasons 3 and season 1 more or less follow what you would consider, quote unquote, the Karate Kid playbook. That's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. Each season is basically doing the same thing each and every time. The difference is, of course, the dynamics between the characters. A lot of them like shift alliances. They go to different groups. They decide to either come together or fall apart and fight against each other. Like the characters are almost like in this weird, like washing machine where they just cycle.
Totally.
And cycle and tumble.
No, that's 100% true.
Yeah.
That is one of the major aspects that makes this show work, and it's the driving engine, which is which side are you on? Mm-hmm. And season 3 then creates an entirely new dynamic where there is not only the Cobra Kai world, and of course, Johnny Lawrence, he himself leaves the world of Cobra Kai because that it gets taken over by his previous sensei, John Kreese.
Played by Martin Kove.
Yeah, who is played by the biggest biter of them all, Marty Krove.
Yeah.
Do we want to talk about the biting scandal?
No.
Why not?
Because I think
my producer is giving me a thumbs down on that. Okay.
Yeah.
No talking about how Marty Krove bit his co-star at a convention.
Nice.
We'll leave that alone.
Thanks for that. Anyway, I love that as like a joke. They added like a third theme in Cobra Kai because obviously you have Miyagi-Do Dojo and then you have Cobra Kai. And then you have Eagle Fang as like the ugly third sister of these dojos.
Which is a good way to, symbolize things because as Cobra Kai gets more extreme, as new senseis come into the fold, because pretty much every season you have a new villain.
Not even a new villain, but like an old villain just gets reintroduced.
Sometimes.
Yeah, most of the time.
In the third season, that's Thomas Ian Griffith's character from Karate Kid 3, Terry Silver, who is basically the version of John Kreese. In season 4, that's actually not really one of the old characters. You would think that they would try to bring in a character like that, but actually season 3 pretty much brings back the whole slate of them, with Kumiko, who is in Karate Kid 2, and the villain, who is Chosen. And Chosen actually comes back, Mike Barnes, too, from Karate Kid 3, in seasons 3 and 4. Both of those characters come back in the form of heroes, and they largely are assets to the show, and they fight the main villain, who ultimately is, I think, Silver. Silver is basically the darkest of the senseis.
Yeah, he is.
And he takes Cobra Kai even deeper and darker past John Kreese's original vision of the dojo. So it becomes an even more twisted version. And as that allegiance shifts, then you have sort of the moderate party. And I guess that's Eagle Fang Karate.
Yeah.
Now, I think also one thing to note here is that obviously as the show becomes slicker, you also lose the character of Aisha, who kind of represents the proletariat of the Cobra Kai cinematic universe. And as the show goes on, more and more characters become more kind of conventional, more Hollywood, I would say. And the show kind of loses a little bit of that scrappy edge from seasons 1 and 2. Not to say that it completely demolishes it, but I would argue that as the show goes on, it sophisticates itself and sort of classes itself up. Do you think that that's necessary as the show goes on, or do you feel like there is a little dilution? Did you feel that as you watched the show, or was that just me?
It's the Netflix machine, because when you have a show like this, and it's like one of the flagship programs in the most major streaming service out there, it's not going to like the quote unquote rough edges, like the edges that actually speak to something larger, because it's supposed to, at the end of the day, appeal to a broad audience, right? And I think it does that by having attractive people doing karate, and this is really important to say, being irreverent to the past, to the nostalgia. And I think that Cobra Kai does it a step better than Stranger Things, because Stranger Things, heralded the past by bringing actors that represented something and then fitting them into the Stranger Things world. It didn't have like a pre-established mythos, it just had inspiration. Whereas Cobra Kai does. Obviously, it has a bunch of Karate Kid movies that introduce a bunch of characters, a lot of which you've mentioned, but also it talks about like the really obscure things. Like I really love the episode where they talk about Johnny's friends, like the other bullies that bullied Daniel. I thought that was so cool because you're breathing life into sections of the mythology that you didn't know existed, that had so much room to grow. And also Elizabeth Shue, she was such an important actress in the first movie as the love interest between Daniel.
And in the 80s.
Yeah, and in the 80s, like she herself is so emblematic as just like a cultural icon. And having her be in an episode to sort of like tie back and even essentially tie that loose end was actually really, really well done. And Cobra Kai has done that really, really well the entire time. And that's what it's really built off of. I think most of the time it does a disservice to its newer characters, not because it's not interested in them, but I think it's just interested in them less, if that makes sense.
Well, but I also think that they drive the plot less. I think that in Stranger Things,
they do.
You get a space where every actor is the same amount of importance. And so all of these new characters get equal weight. And sure, I mean, there's the younger versions in the same way that there are younger characters that get introduced in the later seasons of Stranger Things in Cobra Kai. In Cobra Kai, the characters are Devin and Kenny, who I would say are more or less proxy to the characters in season 5 of Stranger Things. The main difference is Devin and Kenny have a relatively small plot. They do have an important plot, I would say, but a relatively small plot. And I think that, yes, that is partially because we have to make room for what is the main story. But I also think that it was exactly as you said, where we actually get the time to do it and we get the longer episode count. But I also do want to point out, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, Stranger Things didn't have a high episode count, but it did have a high length to each episode.
And a high budget.
But also the length of time that they spent on each episode was significantly longer than the length of time in a Cobra Kai episode. The Cobra Kai episodes are tight, they are character focused, but they are also relatively brief, and they do not expand. Even the longest episodes in the later part of the season are closer to maybe an hour and 10 minutes, but that's more along the lines of what you were talking about with a Game of Thrones than it is to a Stranger Things. When Stranger Things in the 4th season was running 2-3 hour-long episodes.
Yeah, we talked about this. Stranger Things didn't start off as high concept, it became that. But I think that Cobra Kai has always known what it was from the very beginning, and it started from its scrappy beginning. Even though Netflix made it more mainstream, the script still knew that it was low concept. It's just about a bunch of adults and kids doing karate.
I mean, you know, it's like a lower end in that regard show when the highest value actor that you bring on, even above Elizabeth Shue, is like Paul Walter Hauser. And the only reason why Paul Walter Hauser is like a big...
which is crazy.
...actor is because he also plays a lot of like silly characters just like Stingray is on Cobra Kai in mainstream movies like The Naked Gun, and I think he was also in Fantastic Four with Joe Quinn.
He was Mole Man, but that's the thing, he's also a highly decorated he's a very underrated actor, but he's a highly decorated actor because he's appeared in incredibly dramatic roles that have been critically acclaimed. So he is truly a brilliant actor, and you're right to say that he is probably the actor with the most range in terms of like what he's able to do on that show.
And they give him a lot of good material.
They do. But I think he is there because he is having so much fun. But at the same time, it's not necessarily, unlike Stranger Things, which served as such a vehicle for so many of its actors to break out and explode, I think that other than Sholo, it hasn't really happened to anyone else on Cobra Kai. And my argument is, again, it's not necessarily about the characters, other than, of course, Johnny Lawrence and Daniel LaRusso. That's not even because of Cobra Kai. That's actually because of The Karate Kid and how much of a cultural landmark that was. But I would say that the thing that makes Cobra Kai so memorable is its actual forward progression. That very simple formula of like, let's have kids have conflict with each other that causes the adults to have conflict with each other. And then there needs to be a big tournament to figure this conflict out. And it does it so well by sticking to that formula and just making it bigger and bigger and bigger until they're in an international like karate championship, which to me, even though they never left that arena for most of that season, was so dramatically interesting because there was so much stakes. Even though, you know, those characters that we've been following aren't very deep, they have very strong wants. We talk about like wants and needs all the time on this show, and we talk about dimensionality. I think a lot of these kids, even though they are quite three-dimensional, they're more two-dimensional in nature because their wants are so much stronger than their needs, and their wants are really to kick ass, right? I think every character here wants so deeply and truly to kick ass that when you see them...
Is that a word we can say on a podcast without getting flagged for language?
Bleep me if you have to.
Okay.
But I think the point I'm trying to make here is that their wants are so strong and their wants are so engaging that whenever they fail or lose, it becomes a little devastating. And even, especially when they go up against each other, you usually don't know who you want to root for. Especially with Robbie and Miguel, who represent, again, two constantly shifting, conflicting powers that be, because they're both objectively important characters and good heroic characters. They just contrast each other so much that it creates so much conflict. Very much paralleling the two main characters that essentially inspired them, Daniel LaRusso and Johnny Lawrence.
I would argue that, I kind of disagree, and I don't need to spend too much time talking about the kids, but I would argue that the main reason why they wouldn't have taken off is not because their performances aren't substantial. I think that each character on the show more or less holds their own, and I think that that is representative of the child actors. And a good child actor is not always easy to find, and I think that everyone really, really holds their own. I think that is maybe largely because they have retrofitted the characters to match the actors. And you do see that if you look at any behind the scenes of the show, where largely the actors act the way that the characters would on the show. And I think that maybe that also can be the detriment, because more or less there is no ecosystem anymore for a classic TV actor to go on to another show that feels like Cobra Kai. There's just aren't that many shows that get made like this anymore. And that brings me to another point to close this off, which is that you mentioned at the end of our Stranger Things conversation that it just lacks some of that fun. And I actually was really, really against Cobra Kai initially when I was starting to watch the show. I wasn't getting through the first season very well. It was only when I brought my roommate in and we watched it together. But all of a sudden that fun switch hit when I realized that this is just like watching TV from the early 2000s. And you really do see that with the actors on the show. They don't want to really continue on. Maybe that's partially because there isn't an ecosystem like Cobra Kai, but the actors, Jacob Bertrand, who plays Hawk, and Sholo, who plays Miguel, they still have a podcast together. They're still very much friends. This isn't like the fake friends when you're on a set and everybody gets along really, really well. The moment the cameras go off, they go off and do their own things. They're directing their own projects. They're launching a beauty brand. In this show, these characters off screen and on are pals. And that love and that enjoyment and that fun, that just seeps into everything. And I think that that is really, truly what made Cobra Kai such a mainstay in my past year, watching it season after season after season. And sure, maybe I was a little slow to start out because of those early episodes being so scrappy. But even moving from season 2 and beyond, all of a sudden you do really get a sense that this is a kind of show they just don't make anymore. And I think that that is one major lesson. If we're talking about now lessons that we take from this whole network of 1980s nostalgia and nostalgia bait, right? Moving from when J.J. Abrams was making nostalgia bait with the Star Wars sequel trilogy, whether it was J.J. Abrams making nostalgia bait when he was making the movie Super 8, whether it was J.J. Abrams making a nostalgia bait when he was, I think you get the point, Star Trek. All of this stuff does have good bits, but it also has downsides. And it's important to note when something is really successful and when it's translating and when it's making an argument for what Cobra Kai, the show, can look like in 2026 and still be relevant. I'm wondering what you think some of the major takeaways are. If you as a writer were going to write something that was similar to Stranger Things or Cobra Kai, where you're working with material that feels so essential. If you were the writer of Masters of the Universe, the new movie that's coming out in a month or two from when this episode debuts, what exactly would you say is the major artifacts that you would want to leave behind and what you would want to continue on?
Nostalgia is a powerful tool. It's always been that way. And we're seeing new versions of it right now. The new revival of Scrubs came out this week, or is coming out this week.
I just watched the King of the Hill reboot.
Yeah. And the spinoff of The Office, or the sequel really of The Office, The Paper, came out. I watched it all on a very long flight. And I thought it was actually really good.
Excellent.
Nostalgia bait is never going to die, especially in the era we live in. We've talked about this. Everything is an adaptation, a sequel, or a reboot. That's just unfortunately, and sometimes fortunately, the time we live in. More unfortunately than fortunately. And the reason we cover this, and we do this a lot, we try to cover Netflix a lot on this channel because it is the streaming giant, and it's becoming even more so due to current events. But Cobra Kai and Stranger Things represented something a lot larger for Netflix and really for our industry because they were the biggest shows on Netflix. They were just the mainstream things, and they both ended. Cobra Kai ended 2 years ago. Stranger Things ended now.
Just one.
Oh, just one? It also ended last year?
Yeah, it was almost exactly a year from today.
Okay, then there you go. But the point I'm trying to make is both shows ended last year. And you kind of get a sense when you're watching Netflix right now that their only big show left is Bridgerton, technically, in terms of like big budget thing that they throw a lot of money on and attracts a lot of people and has this huge franchise. Because when we talk about Stranger Things, we didn't even talk about like how big of a franchise it is. It has like a Broadway play that has done very well for itself. It has like another, like a spin-off coming out that's like animated, Stranger Things 85 or something like that. And Cobra Kai...
It's an anthology show in the same line that Disney has had many anthology shows about Marvel and Star Wars.
And Star Wars, yeah.
So it really does showcase that it's like blue chip IP. And even Bridgerton, as much as that is sort of the Netflix mainstay, Bridgerton's viewership actually declined this season, this most recent. And I know that it does have spin-offs. It has Queen Charlotte. I would say that more and more people are catching on to the playbook of Bridgerton with new work like Wuthering Heights, whether you loved it or hate it. It is a postmodern version of a costume drama, and it's taking ideas of costume drama and propelling it into a more modern sensibility, whether for good or for ill.
Ultimately, when you look at these shows and you see sort of the weight of them, of just viewership, right? Of how many eyes it can attract, then it becomes like a question of like, okay, what's next? Because these shows were monumental. It cannot be stressed how big they were. And like I said, they've both ended. And we had a similar conversation in a more critical lens about Succession and Ted Lasso of quote unquote prestige television and how they both ended as well. When something ends, you usually don't know what's going to happen next. You can only hope for the next lightning in a bottle, whatever you consider it as such. But if the trend keeps going of this whole nostalgia bait thing, and it most likely will because it's the biggest currency in Hollywood right now, and it has been for many, many years, it's been the defining factor, really, of our generation. Let me put it this way. It's really easy to attract a writer to do projects like these because producers are so attracted to it. But I think the challenge is making it good. And I think in the past couple of years, most attempts have not been good. But Cobra Kai has changed the game in one way. Stranger Things changed the game in another way, two completely different ways, really. But people have learned of like, okay, in order to have some creative independence, we still need to honor the inspiration behind what we're doing. And I think both shows do that more often than not successfully. And that's the thing. If you're taking an IP that's somewhat old, that has history, respect the history. Because if you don't, you will be torn down. That's why The Paper works. That's why the new season of Scrubs works. That's why Cobra Kai
will work, maybe. We haven't seen it yet.
I mean, it's gotten really good reviews.
It can't be reviewed worse than what came directly before it.
Exactly, which was renowned to not respect the history. Right? That's the challenge, because so many writers, producers, creators are very much like, just because we have this idea, it doesn't mean we love this idea. But they have to be like, no, we do love this. This inspired us to begin with, so we need to respect that. And it just ties back to the idea of, here's the real trick. I know I went on and on and on about this, but you asked me a simple question. How do you make this work? Like, what makes this work? It's just love. It's love of the process. It's love of the project. It's love of the history. It's love of the inspiration. It's the love of writing what you're writing. That's it.
And as John Lennon said, all you need is love. And as Netflix once said, what's next for us? You were asking what's next? HBO, baby. And that's what's next on Zeitgeist. Thank you you guys so much for listening. If you did like our podcast, throw a like on whatever podcast player you're listening on. Those of us who are listening on Mixcloud, you can't review us, but I appreciate that you are listening to the hand-curated playlist that I put on every single episode. If you are a new listener, feel free to go to Mixcloud, listen to some of our old episodes, every single episode, except for a few really terrible ones from the very, very early part of our run as a podcast. It was like the first one isn't on Mixcloud, but maybe I'll change that as time moves on if viewers demand it. We are going to be doing our next episode on HBO. We're going to be talking about The Pit, and we're going to be talking about Industry. I would say those are kind of the two big ones, if you're not counting the Game of Thrones world, which we aren't in the sake of our podcast. But maybe later in. On that note, check out those two shows as they are debuting their final episodes by the time this podcast comes out. In the meantime, thank you guys so much for listening. Please tell your friends. I have been your co-host, Jordan Conrad.
I've been Neville Boz.
Love you guys. Thank you guys for tuning in. I will see you again.
Bye, guys.
Stay curious and stay zeitgeist.